Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Baldrige Foundation's Institute for Performance Excellence webinar, Beyond IQ and EQ, Discovering the Superpower of PQ, so Process Intelligence, in High Functioning Leaders. As a reminder, due to the high number of participants, everyone will be kept on mute during the presentations. If you have questions, please submit them to the moderator in the Q&A box located on your control screen. Presenters will answer questions during our panel discussion. Before we get started today, I want to take a moment and recognize members of the Mac Baldrige Society who serve as trustees of the Foundation's Institute for Performance Excellence. It is their generous support that makes presentations like today's possible. Our agenda for today, guest speaker Shane Yount, Chairman, Competitive Solutions, Inc., and I will be here to moderate. And I'd like to turn it over to Shane to get started. Welcome, Shane. Thank you so much for being with us.
Josh, it's great to be here. I was reflecting before we started. I think this is the third webinar I've been able to host with you guys, and I always find them to just be a really rich conversation. And so thank you for having me on again. It's great to be with everyone today. I'm super excited about this topic because so much conversation is happening in industry today, from AI to tariffs to you name it, right? We have all these competing themes that are sucking leaders into a conversation, and it's taking us away from, I believe, talking about one of the most fundamental ways that we as leaders can actually adopt, accept, and drive the kind of change that we need to. And that was really the genesis of understanding what PQ is, which we call process intelligence, and why I'm super excited to talk to the Baldrige Foundation folks today on this topic. So again, thank you, Josh, for having me, and we're going to just jump right in. So as Josh said, I am the chairman of Competitive Solutions, and I am delighted to be with you guys. And I want to spend just a second so you understand how I come at this presentation and how that we as an organization, Competitive Solutions, has engaged over the last 30 plus years. You'll recognize certainly a lot of the names on this chart. And I would suggest to you that these companies approached us over the last several years with really one fundamental theme. How do we make high functioning leaders and in turn, high functioning organizations? And it's those two themes that I want to lean into for the next 45 minutes. How do you create high functioning leaders and in turn, high functioning organizations? I've had the ability to write a couple of books over the years, and I'm super excited to announce in this webinar that later this summer, we're going to be coming out with our fourth book, which is around this very topic, PQ, process intelligence, and why it's a superpower for leaders. Now, just real quickly, so you understand the capabilities of Competitive Solutions, it's really three quick themes. We like to describe it as optimizing people, processes, and performance. And over the years, as I've done these webinars with Baldrige, I've talked about digital transformation with our tool Visuant. I've talked a whole lot about creating an operating cadence and agile teams using our process-based leadership methodology. But today I'm going to talk primarily about leadership. And you're going to hear me describe this idea of IQ, EQ, and then what we will learn today, PQ. And now if you put all those three themes together, you have the highest probability of building a high functioning leader. So that'll be our theme today around leadership and how to do that. Now, let's start with current state, because one of the things I always love to do in webinars is just share a little bit of the data that our team is hearing in industry. And I've been speaking a lot in the last several months at conferences across the world, hearing from leaders around their challenges. I want to give you just a couple of themes, because what I want in this webinar is nothing more than intentional reflection on behalf of the folks listening, to have some very intentional moments, and we'll pause for these, as I share a thought, a theme, a concept that maybe you ask yourself, is this me, right? And the metaphor I would love to use as you listen to me is put a mirror up, because we're gonna put this mirror up, because most of us this morning, we got out of bed, we had our cup of coffee, we jumped in the shower, and we looked in a mirror as we were getting ready for the day. And as you follow that same metaphor, I'm going to ask you to look into a mirror for the next few minutes in two ways. The first way is around yourself as a leader. And as we unpack this idea of IQ and EQ and PQ, I want to speak to you as a leader for the first 15 minutes or so. And then I want to have you put up that proverbial mirror to your organization. Now, your organization may be the team you lead. Maybe it's a team of 5 or 10 people. It could be maybe you're leading a department of 50 people. Maybe you're leading a facility of 100 or 1,000 people. Whatever that team is that you're leading, that's the theme I want you to think about as we spend the next 15 to 20 minutes talking about high functioning organizations. So where's leadership today? A couple of thoughts I would ask you to reflect on. We are hearing a theme over and over and over again around leadership fatigue. And I'm going to suggest to you in the next few minutes, there is a reason why this leadership fatigue is so prominent and prevalent today. So first of all, I want you to ask yourself, are you tired? Are you experiencing this leadership fatigue? Do you hear it in your organization? The second thing we're hearing across HR leaders, I was at an HR conference down in Florida recently, and they said, as we look at trends among people in our organization and leaders in our organization, we're hearing two distinct themes. One is on scaling, one is on sustaining. And I'm going to speak extensively today around, do you have a system that scales leadership capacity? And then after it's scaled, do you have a system that sustains it? Because you're going to hear me describe too often, and this is a little teaser, too often, many leaders have built their career by managing by personality. And a lot of leaders have gotten very high in the organization in terms of their levels and their responsibilities and their authorities because they were masterful at managing by personality. And I'm going to describe this in a moment, but let me go ahead and say here, managing by personality, it doesn't scale and it doesn't sustain. And so how do we fix that? We're going to unpack that. This next one I think is super important. Everyone loves to want to be characterized as a learning organization. When you ask people, do you believe in leadership development? Do you believe that we should have systems and processes that are always growing our leaders? But then when you start drilling into that, you very quickly find that there's often an aspirational view of that, but behind it, not really an intentional system. And this last one, I think is startling to me. 73% of leaders feel their current skills will need to change completely or almost completely to be able to be successful in work in 2030. Now just think about that for a second. 73% of leaders today feel their skills will have to change completely, 100% recreation to be able to be this successful leader of the future. And so if that's you as a leader struggling with these themes, trying to wrap your head around what made me successful today, will it make me successful tomorrow? We're going to talk about that today because I would suggest to you that what got many leaders here is not going to get them there. So let's start with what got us here, right? Having been in this space for 30 plus years and worked with thousands of leaders, there is a model of leadership development that I think resonates across industry. And I'll start with the simplest one, which is IQ. Listen, I've got to believe that you would not be at the Baldrige Foundation webinar today if you didn't possess a certain level of IQ, right? I believe people that attend these things, they're the folks in the organization that want to be the best version of themselves. They want to be constantly improving themselves. And so I think we look to our HR partners, we look to our recruiting partners to say, when we have an open requisition, we want you to find the best and the brightest. There's nothing wrong with that logic. We should expect them to do that, right? But I think there's some dangers. And in every one of these slides, I'm going to talk about a danger to get you in that intentional moment of reflection to see, is this danger in your organization today? So let's talk about a couple of dangers here. I'm hearing this a lot. Post-COVID, tremendous post-COVID leadership challenges. And you think about, well, how do we place people in leadership roles? I think this is where you often see IQ very pronounced, where we look at operators and analysts and technicians and engineers and we say, you're the best, you're the brightest, you're the smartest one in your team. And because you have the highest IQ and you've demonstrated such a level of proficiency in that role and in that task and in that function, we're going to make you the leader. You know what? You're going to be a great leader, right? Because you've demonstrated that you've mastered this. So you should naturally be able to master being a great leader. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not always the case, right? And in fact, I think we often promote the highest competent person based on their skills and their role, not necessarily the folks that want to be a leader. And because of that, I think, again, this is post-COVID. I was in a company in the Midwest a couple of months ago, and they said, Shane, we're having a problem we've never had before. And this is a 100-year plus company. And I thought they were going to talk about the normal things I hear every week, right? Like inflation, tariffs, you name it, right? There's a lot of business headwinds today, but it wasn't those. What they said was challenging them today was no one internally wants to be that frontline leader. That for the first time in the history of their organization, they were having to go external for frontline leader candidates. And I think this is the case in a lot of organizations today because people look at those individuals in those roles and they say, that kind of looks like a lose-lose. They're stressed out. There's that leadership fatigue that is very prevalent and they see it firsthand. And I think it's causing people to look at that and say, well, I don't really know if I want that role anymore. And this is quite shocking for a lot of organizations because many folks, particularly traditional organizations, have this ladder, right? You start as an operator, a technician, an engineer, you get to lead a project, you become a team lead, a supervisor, a manager, and so on. And I think people are looking at that traditional ladder and they're saying, I don't know if the view's worth the climb anymore on that ladder. So I would suggest by starting that we hire for IQ, which we should, but there's some dangers there. Let's look at the second piece, EQ. Now, I'm sure the Baldrige Foundation has done multiple webinars over the years and training about emotional intelligence. And I love this. And we could spend all day talking about the importance and power of EQ, right? And very simply, the way we describe it at Competitive Solutions is teaching leaders how to show up, right? How do you show up and demonstrate empathy, leadership presence, executive presence, understanding change management, all those critical conversations that leaders need to master. And there's tremendous value in the power of EQ. And so, you think about what I've described so far. We hire for IQ, we train for EQ. Probably many people on the webinar right now have had some levels of training in EQ, and it's a very powerful concept to understand. However, let's talk about some dangers here. What we see often is in dominant IQ, EQ leaders is that dominant IQ, EQ leaders can create and drive leadership fatigue and personality dependency. And I'm going to unpack this more in a minute. But if running the business is dependent on what I know and then using my EQ to leverage persuasion and leverage positional authority and leverage my proximity to the team, if driving results still depends on, in essence, my personality, manifesting in proximity, persuasion, and position, look, that's a pretty scary place to lean into to drive business because it makes the business dependent on a smart person who's got EQ. And that will drive this leadership fatigue and this personality dependency. Secondly, it doesn't scale, right? It simply doesn't scale because performance is dependent on the personalities, right? And I'll give you just an example of this. We're doing a lot of work right now with Impossible Foods. And I love this organization, right? And you think about this organization for those on the webinar that may not know. Impossible Foods is plant-based beef. This is a food category that didn't even exist a couple of decades ago, even a decade ago, right? literally brilliant people who created this food category. IQ off the chart, right? It's also a very socially conscious organization who has very strong foundations of EQ. But go back to a comment that I said a second ago. What got us here won't get us there. And as I look at that organization, the reason they invited us in to help them was they said, "Hey, Shane, Competitive Solutions, we're super proud of what we've built, the category we've created, the culture we're building, but our leaders are tired. Our leaders are fatigued. And we're starting to see that what got us here is not going to get us there. It's not going to scale us to what the business is demanding of us right now." And then I think you see this manifest in one other way, right? And I bet many people on the call have seen this firsthand, where you see my last danger here. It builds loyalty to personality, maybe not necessarily to the mission or to the organization. What do I mean by that? How many times in our career have we seen a very charismatic leader, leave the organization? And everyone is just despondent, right? That we've lost this super smart, great EQ person. But then a couple of months go by, and suddenly you see another group of people leave because that person who left has now reached out to those individuals who often have dominant IQ and EQ and said, "Hey, I'm over here now. I'd love to work with you again. Why don't you come and see if there's opportunities here?" I just got a call this past week from a senior executive who there is a real brain drain in his organization right now because they had some very charismatic leaders who have left, and they're pulling out those same charismatic leaders to follow them. And he said, "Shane, I think I've missed the fundamental lesson of being a CEO. And that is that instead of building loyalty to the mission and the brand and the organization and the products, we allowed people to become loyal to personalities." And so I'd ask you just to again reflect for a moment and say, do we have dominant IQ, EQ leaders? And while that sounds good on the surface, are there underlying rumblings where we're going to have to address, right? And I'll just pause here for just a second because you might be asking yourself, "Well, I don't know, maybe I'm an IQ leader, maybe I'm an EQ leader, but let's just drill into this for just another moment because I want to pose a question to get you to kind of look in that proverbial mirror for a second, right? It's a pretty simple question. What's powering performance in your team today? Now let's even unpack it further, right? If I said what's powering performance, what's driving the focus, urgency, and accountability in your organization today? Because when you really begin to think about that question, dominant IQ EQ leaders often show up in this way. They show up learning how to really manage by personality, and that managing by personality looks like this. When I'm there, when I'm in close proximity to the organization, things happen. I have a heightened confidence that the displays of focus, urgency, and accountability will happen. I see this all the time in my role, right? One of the things that I do with our clients is I'll do a lot of site visits. And so, a group of executives will say, "Hey, we're going to go visit this plant, or we're going to go visit this R&D center, or we're going to go visit this team." And it's always interesting to me that I would love if these visits were like a surprise, right? There's that show, and listen, I'll be the first to say it's a little cringy, but that show Undercover Boss, right? The whole premise of that show is that when you show up and people don't know who you are, you get to kind of see the reality of work, right? But unfortunately, the folks I travel with, they're not. I guess they don't watch that show. I don't know, but every place I go on these trips, they know we're coming, right? They know weeks in advance, right? That the senior executive team is visiting. And we, I think, all have this tendency that when we know a CEO or a COO or a senior executive team is coming to our site or our plant or our location, we have a tendency to suddenly want to make it look great, right? And suddenly all these things that we've learned in the Baldrige Institute, they're big in all of these things in black there, right? And we want to go out and we want everything to be clean. Like 5S suddenly becomes all important again. And we want all the digital boards to tell a good story. And we want all the metrics to be green. And, we go through this whole exercise of creating, in essence, a false positive. And while we're there, and I'll be on one of these tours next week, right? While we're there, everything is going to look beautiful, right? But as soon as they drive us back to the airport and we get on the plane to wave goodbye, I know there'll be a collective sigh of relief because what drove performance during that tour had nothing to do with good systems. It had nothing to do with this idea of PQ that we're going to learn in a minute, this process intelligence. It had everything to do with the physical proximity of that leader or those leaders to that organization. Because what drove the performance was not system driven, it was personality driven. That's not scalable. That's not sustainable, right? Often I also see this manifest. I'll give you another example where a personality driven leader often drives performance through powers of persuasion. Now, I'm going to make a statement. I'm not trying to be provocative. It's just my experience having done this for 30 plus years. I think there are very few true teams functioning in industry today. Now, what do I mean by that? True teams. We call every work group, every project, every department a team often, right? We label any multiple group of people a team. But often what you see is a team powered by selective engagement, not collective accountability. And this is what I mean by the power of persuasion, right? A team where the performance is powered by selective engagement, not collective accountability. What's that look like? I was out in Seattle recently and I was attending tier meetings. And I'm a huge advocate of tier meetings. I think this is a backbone system of any high functioning organization. And I was visiting this site for 4 days. And so every morning I would get up and be at the site at 6 a.m. and I would start this tier process of visiting these tiers every day for 4 days. And then Monday, the first meeting, I went in this meeting, there's probably 15 people in the room, right? This tier meeting, the shop floor tier meeting. And there was a rich conversation of about 4 people, right? In that team of 15. And I thought, well, that was a good conversation, right? I went back the next day, 6 a.m., and there was another rich conversation, but it was the same 4 people. Went back Thursday or Wednesday rather, same rich conversation, 3 or 4 people, right? Where are the other 11 people, right? And I see this so often in organizations that what's really powering performance has, again, nothing to do with system and process. It has to do with being able to persuade a select group of people that you can lean into and lean on, right, to move the business forward. But there's this huge gap of other individuals that are, in my language, they're spectators, not players, right? And one of the reasons, again, we have this leadership fatigue is we've built a culture that's powering performance, not of collective accountability, but of selective engagement. These few people that are doing the heavy lift, and they're creating not, again, a culture of players, but a culture of spectators. And listen, if all else fails, there are folks on this webinar. I mean, you've got a title of a leader. You could be a team leader. You could be a supervisor. You could be a departmental manager, a vice president, right? You can compel performance by your positional authority, right? We know that works, right? You can direct. You have the authority to do that. And I would just ask you, just in a moment of reflection, to say, are you a leader who is powering performance based on your personality? Because that's often how IQ EQ shows up, right? It's how it manifests, that we get really good at driving performance through our proximity, our powers of persuasion, and our positional authority. But I'll go back to those 2 words I said when we started. That won't scale. And that won't sustain the kind of high functioning culture and leaders that I want to talk to everyone about today. So, what's the solution? We're going to learn something today called PQ. And again, I couldn't be more excited about this because this is a message that it's certainly in the last couple of conferences that I've spoken at seems to be very resonant. Leadership fatigue is real. Our inability to scale and sustain is real. And we have to begin to think about leadership development differently. Yes, we still need to hire smart people. Yes, we still need to train them on the power of emotional intelligence. But the link that I want to emphasize today is this idea of PQ, process intelligence. What is it, right? Now you see this model over to the right there. And the model of PQ has 4 tenets. 4 what I will describe to you as non-negotiable systems that leaders have to understand. Because if we want to scale and sustain, these four systems are the non-negotiable systems leaders have to build and deploy and implement and create this leadership legacy culture. I'll say more on this at the end, but one of the reflection points I would love for you to kind of put in the back of your mind in the next few minutes is, if you left tomorrow, you often hear the metaphor, if I won the lottery and left, right? If you left tomorrow, and I actually saw a stat just the other day that said there are 10,000 baby boomers retiring every day in North America. So this isn't pie in the sky, right? 10,000 baby boomers retiring every day in North America. If you're a leader and you left, what's your leadership legacy? Because I'm going to suggest to you, if you've led through the power of IQ and EQ, you might be shocked how quickly your leadership legacy atrophies, how quickly it vanishes, how quickly it goes away. And no one wants to hear that, because we want to leave something durable and lasting. But to leave something durable and lasting, we have to build a system. And I love this quote you see in orange here. And this is from Atomic Habits. And if you haven't read Atomic Habits, I would encourage you to do that. But it really says, we do not rise to the level of our goals, we sink to the level of our systems. Now, what's that mean, right? Here's a really good way to think about that. How many times have you seen a leader move up, move on, move out, right? And I'm not saying even retire, like move, take a promotion, take a lateral, right? But a leader of a team move up, move on, move out, and within days, the performance of that team atrophies. Within days, we put a new leader in, it feels like we're starting over, right? So much of leadership transition, this leadership ladder that we've been told works with IQ and EQ, causes us to start over every time a new leader steps into a team. And that's purely indicative of that we've not built the right systems. So the systems that I want to touch on in my next 15 minutes deal with four themes. You see the theme on the right of the circle there called business acumen. I want to spend a few minutes talking about just the way we think about metrics and goals and KPIs. I want to spend some time thinking about how PQ looks relative to an execution process, an accountability process. I want to spend some time talking about what a PQ system looks like and how we communicate and how we build a good cadence and rhythm so that we understand PQ communication systems. And then I'll close with talking about this navy blue ring that you see on there, which is this idea of how are ideal behaviors set? What do those look like? Why are they important? Now, for the first 15 minutes, I've spoken to you as a leader, and I've asked you to think about IQ, EQ. Are you building a culture powered by selective engagement or collective accountability? Are you leaning into your proximity, powers of persuasion, and positional authority to drive performance? But I want to migrate that mirror that we're looking into to now think about a high functioning organization. And how does PQ look in terms of low functioning and high functioning relative to the theme of business acumen? And with each of the four themes on our PQ circle model, I'm going to show you some similar thoughts. What does a low functioning team look like? What's a high functioning team look like? And I've got just a couple of words here, but I want to unpack each of these. And if you're taking notes, these are some places I want you to take some notes and remember to give you some reflection points when we're done today. So the first thing is I want to start with a question on every one of these slides, right? And the first question on this slide I'd love for you to write down and remember is the capacity of people to know if they're winning or losing. What's that mean, right? The capacity of people to know if they're winning or losing. So maybe you're listening to me at your office or your department or in your facility right now, right? And when we're done here, you're going to step out and go grab some lunch or grab a soda out of the Coke machine. And as you're doing that, I'd love for you just to conduct a quick exercise. Ask two or three people this random question. Right now, as an organization, are we winning or losing? Or right now in your team, are you winning or losing? Super simple question. But what I've found in the last 30 plus years, it's amazing how we can or can't answer that question. Every conference I've spoke at in the last 5 years, everyone's talking about data. But I want to unpack a little bit of that in the way we view data today. So let's start with this slide here, low functioning. If you went out and asked that question right now, are we winning or losing? What kind of answer would you get? Would you get an anecdotal answer? What's anecdotal mean? I describe it as based on how people feel, right? Is the answer you would get from asking that question today, would it be an anecdotal answer? Would my answer be, if you asked me that question, Shane, is your team winning or losing? Would it be based on how I'm feeling in this moment? Would I be happy? Because hey, maybe everyone showed up today. Maybe we have the ability, because everyone showed up today, that workload is more evenly dispersed, right? Or did I show up today and half the team is working remotely and the other half of the team is not here, and now I'm feeling this burden because all this work falls on me, so I'm frustrated, right? That's just one example. Would my answer be anecdotal or would my answer be empirical? Empirical meaning I know the metrics that matter. I know how I connect to those metrics. I know there is a communication system that informs me on a 7-day cycle. Did I win or did I lose? And so, in answering that question, I can expect an empirical answer based on what I know, not how I feel, right? I talked about this idea of data, and I would suggest to you that we've missed an opportunity with data. I would wager that right now, the folks listening to this webinar, you probably have in your inbox at this moment at least 5 emails from different parts of the business with some dashboard, scorecard, KPI, metric attached in that email that you have no intention of opening, that you have no intention of looking at, talking about, using, right? Because somewhere, some point at some time, this data, this chart, this scorecard, this dashboard was created. It was an exercise in visualization, and you have no intention of utilizing it to move the business forward. See, I think this is a fundamental question organizations need to ask themselves. Have we spent too much time visualizing data and not enough time utilizing data? I'll give you for instance. I was in a plant in Europe last year, and they built this entire room. This was like a super cool room, right? It was like Star Trek, Star Wars room. You walked in this room, it was flat screen monitors on every inch of wall space in that room, running real time data, right? About how the organization's performing in that moment. And every team was expected to have their team meeting in this room, right? So they would be surrounded by all this data to in theory, enable a good conversation. It was an exercise in visualization. There was no utilization. When I talk about utilization, let me give you 3 words if you're taking notes to remember. Good utilization takes 3 forms. The first form is we use it to educate people on the metrics that matter, right? Secondly, we use it to facilitate the meetings that we're in. And then thirdly, we use it to motivate and iterate continuous improvement. 3 key words there, and they rhyme so you can remember them. Educate, facilitate, motivate. That should be, when you look at metrics, if you can't articulate your educate, facilitate, and motivate slash iterate process, if you can't articulate that around each metric, then I would suggest to you your metrics are nothing but an exercise in visualization. Now, here's a metaphor I'd love, if you take nothing else that I say away today, for you to remember. How do metrics live in your business today? Do they live as thermometers or thermostats? 30 plus years, I would suggest to you that most metrics live in organizations as nothing more than thermometers. What's a thermometer? I have 2 sons. I was sharing with Josh where we started. My oldest is 27, my youngest is 25, and they're building their lives and careers, which is awesome. And we do Sunday dinners. And my younger son was over the other Sunday for dinner, and he wasn't feeling well. My wife did the motherly thermometer, right? Put her hand on his forehead. Oh, you feel a little warm. I mean, not empirical, right? Went and got a thermometer, took his temperature, had a little bit of a fever. The thermometer is not going to make him feel better. It's not going to treat any symptoms. All it's going to do is give you a passive report. That's it, right? And so many metrics live organizationally as these passive reports, as these thermometers, as opposed to a thermostat. So I'm coming to y'all from our Raleigh headquarters, right? I'm in our executive boardroom today, and the team that was meeting in this room before me are they're a little more cold natured than I am, and so they had the thermostat set a little higher than I like. So I walked in, and the room was about 76 degrees. For me personally, that's not an ideal temperature, right? If all I had was a thermometer, I'd be giving this webinar probably a little bit warm. But fortunately, I could go over to the thermostat on the wall and say, 76 isn't feeling really good for me. I'm going to take this down to 72. That's more ideal for me. That simple mindset and metaphor is how we need to view metrics. And so many organizations don't. They don't view their metrics thermostatically. They don't have a system that educates, facilitates, and motivates, right? They don't have a system that every 90 days we look at those metrics and we ask the question, so what, right? I was on a call right before this with an organization, and they admitted as we were talking through this that they view metric setting as a calendar driven exercise, a transactional calendar driven exercise where we take our best guess, by the end of January is their deadline, to try to set some metrics. We hope we get it right. And then we just track these metrics for the next 365 days, right? That is the absolute worst way to think about a business acumen process. We've got to think about business acumen as a thermostatic system that we use the inputs of data to educate, facilitate, and motivate continuous improvement. That's what thermostatic looks like with business acumen. And then the last thing I just want to hit on here real quickly is when we think about metrics, how do they manifest in our meetings? I've been in a lot of meetings from C-suite down to shop floor where we use metrics just to do storytelling, right? We say, well, here's the metrics this week. Here's what happened. Here's where it happened. Here's when it happened. Here's why it happened. Here's who it happened to, right? We tell these great stories every time we look at the metrics. And then we end up telling a very similar story the next time we look at the metrics. Are you a storytelling culture or explanation, or do you want to be an execution culture? Do we want to build an execution culture where the part of the story that's most important is what's going to be different the next time we run these metrics? What actions are we going to take as a result of the story we just told? Because what you're going to see is as we think about the way metrics live, it isn't just building a ladder of connected data, it's building a ladder of execution. And execution through the tiers, right? Maybe today you still have a simple whiteboard, which listen, I love, right? There is a danger in digitization. Everyone wants to digitize everything today. And what I'm seeing more often than not is through that digitization effort, we build a culture not of players, but of more spectators. We don't need more spectators. We need people that are engaged in moving the business forward, in essence, engaged in creating an execution culture. Because to us, real quickly, a lot of people think just getting good KPIs and good metrics and good scorecards, that's 90% of the solution to be a high functioning organization. We would tell you that's 50% of the solution. The other 50% is bolting onto those metrics a narrative of execution. Let me say that again. Bolting onto those metrics a narrative of execution. I'll describe how we engage, right? So in the organizations that we work with, we help them build these thermostatic scorecards and KPIs. And then we attach to that with the same rigor and discipline a system that we call an action register. Basically, it is the manifestation of your execution process. And so when we bolt those two things together, we have the capacity, and we have a couple of teams this week all over the country doing this. They will go back and visit one of these organizations and they will say, hey, pull up your KPIs from the second week of February. And then pull up your execution process from the second week of February. And if I see 4 or 5 red metrics on your KPIs from the second week of February, I'm going to expect to then see 4 or 5 based on the number of red KPIs. I'm going to expect to see 4 or 5 corresponding, bolted on, very clearly articulated execution plans that literally read, in response to red metric X, our execution plan is Y. So I have bolted on to that KPI what we're going to do as a result of that thermostatic process that it's now telling us. And then my team is going to say, now let's look at your KPI and your execution plan from the third week of February, and let's see what thermostatic impact that had. See, ladies and gentlemen, building a high functioning organization means we have to get serious about execution and serious about accountability. And so I would love for you to think for a moment about a couple, again, low functioning, high functioning behaviors here. And it starts with just, how do you even talk about execution? How do you talk about accountability? See, too often I think we've watered it down. What do I mean by watering it down? That when we talk about accountability and execution, a non-PQ leader will use words like ownership, involvement, responsibility, empowerment. In the same way, they talk about execution and accountability. And when we merge those words together, we make it an emotion, not an act. You know, I gave you a question in the previous slide about business acumen to go out and ask people, are we winning or losing? Here's the question I want you to write down on this slide. What have you done to move the business forward? Listen to that. What have you done to move the business forward? So question one is like, are we winning or losing, right? You're establishing that I understand the business. You're establishing that I have built a process, a system that informs me, it educates, facilitates, and motivates me so that I understand the metrics that are important. The second question is, now that you have that institutional knowledge, now that you have that business acumen, what have you done to move the business forward? Now we're making accountability not an emotion, not an attitude, not a feeling, but an act. And if we make it an act, and this is where dominant PQ leaders thrive. They begin to change the narrative of execution and accountability from an emotion, from a feeling, to an act. And an act can be measured. An act can be visible. It can be demonstrative. It can be documented. And I don't want you to lose that theme, because when an act of execution, when an act of accountability is visible and personal and measurable, you're now building what we call a database of engagement. You're building a true accountability system. And when you build that system, and you're going to see momentarily, now I am creating an opportunity for me to be able to measure engagement. HR people love when I talk about this, because this struggle of, how do you measure engagement? And so often, because we made execution and accountability an emotion, right? A feeling, it's hard. And so performance management is hard, right? It's hard for people to wrap their head around how you coach and how you counsel and how you do performance management. But a PQ leader with good systems recognizes, I'm building a database of engagement. I'm changing the narrative from this feeling-based ignorance as an excuse type of system into a way that I am building a culture not of spectators, but of players, right? Not of meeting tourists, but of meeting drivers. I just have to share this because it personally triggers me. There are still organizations that we work with that are doing so many virtual meetings. And I was in one the other day, and this is a virtual meeting that started in COVID. It's not been stopped or killed. It needs to be stopped and killed. It's every Friday at 3 o'clock, and there's an invite of 50 people. And every Friday at 3 o'clock, you have people log into this virtual meeting, and no one's cameras are on, and except the facilitator. And when I was in this meeting the other day, there was one other camera was on, and it was a new hire who couldn't turn their camera off. They didn't know how, right? And so you had two faces. You had about 30 people who were just initials. And I asked myself, is this meeting moving the business forward? What are we doing here, right? We are allowing cultures of meeting tourists, not meeting drivers. And it comes to this place where we've got to relook at our expectations of engagement. We've got to recalibrate in this PQ mindset. How do we build a business acumen process where our KPIs are a system and we bolt onto that system? You see on the left there, this robust, visible, accountable way, so that when we begin to do that, we begin to create this thermostatic application of engagement. And when you have that, here's what's really cool: you can begin to measure engagement. Go back to the question I said, what have you done to move the business forward? When we as leaders begin to build PQ systems, this is something that's really cool. We teach doing this every quarter. And it's super simple. Every quarter, you get the leader to list every person's name on their team. You go to your accountability system, which is visible, personal, and measurable, and you just run a query, right? Number of actions taken by member in the last 90 days, number of actions completed by member in the last 90 days, impact of that action against the metric in the last 90 days. And that last column is really meant to reflect that the actions you took, because they're bolted onto the scorecard, are moving the business forward. And a lot of our clients will just very simply do a low, medium, high, right? Like one is low, two medium, three high, and they take every completed action and they assign a value and they get a cumulative score. And listen, if you were just looking at that chart, you can very quickly see what I described in the earlier slides. Is the performance in your team today being powered by system and process or by personality? And one of the most revealing things as we teach leaders this idea of PQ is the aha moment that they have when we begin to put systems in place to measure engagement, for them to see firsthand that the way you're managing and leading your team is often creating a team of dependency. It's often creating a team of selective engagement, not collective accountability. Because you can look at the data here, and this is common data reflected for the purposes of this webinar, is that often we build a team of individuals we lean into early and often, and individuals we do not go to at all. And we do not go to them because maybe they're difficult, they're problematic, they're not pleasant. Maybe we have this view that they don't want to engage, and so consequently we say the view's not worth the climb, and we don't engage them. And what you find is, and this is a chapter in our book coming out this summer, is you find that the biggest demotivating factor in teams is that disparity of engagement. And the team looks at the leader and they say, we're dealing with this disparity of engagement every day. Do something, help us. And it's teaching leaders how to use good systems to give you the data, so then I could make decisions on this team and how they're performing or not performing. Listening, I've got a few minutes left and I want to hit the final ones here because these are no less important, right? Think about what we're talking about with PQ, teaching leaders how to use good systems to create a business acumen process, to create a good execution process. But then let's talk for a second about how we operationalize those, how we build a meeting cadence so that meeting cadence actually moves the business forward. Look, I think there's a reason that there is such leadership fatigue today. And one of them is many leaders wake up in the morning, they get their first cup of coffee, right? They sit down at their kitchen table, they open up their Outlook, and in their inside voice, they say, how am I going to get any work done when I'm literally in meetings from the moment I log in or show up to the moment I log off or go home, right? We're still in a culture, and I think it's a post-COVID hangover, where we are meeting ourselves to death. The second point, if you take nothing else that I say away today, the first one was thermometer and thermostat. The second one is we can't be high-functioning leaders when we do not control our calendars. We cannot be high-functioning leaders when we allow our meetings and our calendars to be hijacked with activities that are not moving the business forward. You see a couple of points here that for some of us may be shocking, right? Number one is that statistic down there where I think, and we see this proven out week after week, leaders are spending 60 to 80% of their time in meetings. What do we believe? We believe high functioning leaders run their business in 6 hours of meetings a week or less. Let me say that again, 6 hours of meetings a week or less. High functioning leaders, if they are applying the appropriate PQ business acumen and PQ execution, we should be able to operationalize a communication process with those elements that allows us to do that, right? Here's a third question for this slide. First one was, are we winning or losing? The second one was, what have you done to move the business forward? The third one is this. Did the time we just spent in this meeting, did it move our business forward? Did the time we just spent in this meeting, did it move our business forward? Look, where do we often talk about ineffective meetings, right? We walk out of the meeting. I'm walking with Josh down the hallway. I say, for the love of God, right? I just lost 5 hours of my life. I'm never going to see it again. I think I aged 10 years, right? And then the next week, Josh and I are in the same meeting, right? And I'm texting Josh under the table the vomit emoji because I'm like, make it stop. And it's this cycle of things we get into where we just accept it as a cost of doing business. High functioning leaders do not accept poor meeting management as a cost of doing business because they know I can't be a high functioning leader when I allow those behaviors to happen. So, how do we fix that, right? Well, we don't have enough time to unpack all of this slide. But I would tell you, we've got to build discipline and we've got to build a cadence and we've got to get leaders understanding that operationalizing PQ is not just creating KPIs and creating good execution systems. It's operationalizing that into a conversation, into a cadence of conversations that happen on a routine cycle. And there is an iteration component there that every time before we walk out of that meeting, we're going to ask ourselves, did this add value, right? Did it move us forward as an enterprise? And so I can certainly talk more about this, and I'll have an opportunity at the end of the presentation to share some additional slides with you guys on that. I want to close with just the final element on the model, and then just some closing comments, and have hopefully a moment for questions here. But there is one final element of PQ that cannot be minimized. And even in the model, the way I created it, I wanted to reflect that. How do you hold it all together? And this final ring around it is the ring of the setting of ideal behaviors. When I think about, even really good teams and the difference between really good teams and great teams, it often deals with the ability of great teams knowing how to set ideal behaviors, knowing how to get in a room and say, as a leader, here are the ideal behaviors I have of you as my team. Now, what are your ideal behaviors as a team that you have of me as a leader? And sitting down in a framework in an intentional manner. And the ideal behaviors are not metrics, they're not meeting. It's how we're going to operate in this framework. It's what you expect of me and I expect of you, and framing it in a way that's not just a bunch of aspirational statements, but rather demonstrative statements that begin with do or demonstrate. What do we expect you to do to live up to that ideal behavior? What do I expect you to demonstrate to live up to that ideal behavior? And to sit intentionally and create that and codify that. And then every 90 days, here's the fourth and final question, right? Did we live up to or fall short of our ideal behaviors? I cannot stress that final question enough. Are we living up to or falling short of our ideal behaviors? There's a lot of books written out there about straight talk and candid conversations and all of that. And look, I believe in the theory of that. But if we haven't sat down as a team to define and codify ideal behaviors, don't think candid conversations or crucial conversations or straight talk is going to be a natural thing that happens. You have to have a baseline to be able to do that, and that's the ideal behaviors. And so, what have I said to everyone today on the webinar as we wrap up? PQ at the end of the day, it's a run the business methodology. To move an organization away from dependency on personality and dependency on system. Now, some people say to me, "Well, Shane, are you saying personality's bad?" And I want to be very, very intentional, and I want you to hear what I'm going to say next, right? We need systems to run the business. We need personalities to do the things that we are naturally built as humans to do on top of the system. And what are those things we're naturally built as humans to do on top of the system? Those are the things that I think many of us want to do: affirmation, recognition, coaching, counseling, intentional time in building relationships, correcting, right? Performance management. It's using our personality to do the things it was designed to do, which is relationship. But if you're trying to use your personality to run the business, you're probably fatigued. You're probably tired. You're not going to be able to scale and you're not going to be able to sustain. We need good systems for that. So, dominant PQ organizations, they build thermostatic metrics that they iterate every 90 days. They bolt onto that an execution process that elevates expectations of engagement. They operationalize it in a cadence of communication. They set ideal behaviors that holds it all together. And then they codify it such that says when a new leader or a new member joins the team, and this is powerful, in the first day, not first month, first day, they sit with that new leader or new member and they say, "Welcome to the team. Here's how we roll. Here's our system." And if we have that system, then it allows us as leaders to operate in this space, which is the transformational space, right? Which is the space that allows us to be in the things we want to do, which often can't because we're running around trying to just keep the business moving, right? With sheer brute force and determination. We can get in that transformation space, in that growth mindset, only when we've got really good dynamic PQ systems. Josh, I want to thank the Baldrige group for letting me talk to the group today. You know, one of the things that I always like to offer to the Baldrige attendees, because they are such participants with IQ, right, is how do we get more information? And so we've got a QR code here that if you scan that, I would love to give you not only these slides, but an expanded version that didn't allow me in a webinar to talk about, but maybe give you some additional insights for that as well going forward. And so thank you all for your time today. I hope you found value in it. And Josh, I'm going to hand it back over to you, sir, to close us out.
Thank you, Shane. I really appreciate it. Fantastic webinar and easy to see the connection points between um, the way that we develop organizations and leaders and Baldrige, of course. And so that's great, fantastic, love it. A couple of questions here as I'm glancing over at the Q&As that have come in throughout the course of the webinar. I'll start off one here with you. It says, what advice do you have for leaders trying to move from a reactive management to a more structured, process-driven approach that support Baldrige's goals? And also maybe, Shane, on that, maybe tack on there are a lot of organizations through the chat here that have expressed, hey, talk to us a little bit about how do we get rolling with this? How do we get started with this concept of using a personality, um, you know, moving from introducing PQ into an organization that's typically used personality-driven leadership style?
Yeah, Josh, it's a great question. And, I think the first step is, what do you always say? Self-actualization, right? So I think you got to ask yourself, are you that 3P leader, right? Are you using today proximity, persuasion, and positional authority to get stuff done? That's where it starts. Secondly, then think about the circle model that I talked about, because not only did I talk about it in that cadence today on the webinar, the way you move to a PQ environment is in that design cadence as well. You've got to start with what we have in common. And what we have in common are the metrics. So building that PQ process around business acumen. So you're connecting people to the mission, not the personality, helping them understand how we use metrics to educate, facilitate, and motivate. That's step one, right? Step two is building that accountability process. And a good thing to do is literally many groups today, you've got some version of an action log, action list. Are you using that as just a meeting device, or are you
Mm,
using it as an accountability system? That's a great place to start, right? Are
mm,
you are you engaging your team with the select few or the collective many, right? Have you fallen into a pattern of selective engagement? So a lot of getting started with the PQ mindset is actualization to start, and then introducing some simple tools to help you start building systems. That's the way you get started.
Well, as you know, Baldrige is all about systems. We are all about that, for sure. Give me an example of a tool or practice that helps reduce leadership fatigue. I look over here, it's been a common theme in some of the questions.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about that concept.
Look, and again, I'll go back, right? So if you look at your team and you say, it's just easier if I do it. So let's say I've got an action, I've got a project, you've got some task that needs to get done, and you look at your team and you say, look, it's just easier if I do it. I've given Josh a lot lately. I don't want to overwhelm him. The worst thing that can happen is if he leaves, I don't want to go to John or Seth or Paul, right? I'm just going to do it myself. Then that's the number one cause of leadership fatigue. So the second way you break out of that is you've got to start asking yourself, am I building a culture of dependency or accountability? And the way you transition to a culture of accountability is we've got to institute, we call it an action register. And it's a super simple way to begin to start thinking about how you delegate tasks to bring visibility to accountability. Because if you continue to do for people what they ought to be doing for themselves, you're never going to break that leadership fatigue. And the way you migrate to a culture of accountability is you got to have that system. We call it an action register. We digitize it in a tool that we use called Visuant, which is and I'm not just proud of it because I am proud of it, right? But there is no better execution system that we believe on the market today than Visuant as a way to make accountability visible, personal, and measurable. Because when you start making it that way, then you view execution as this database of engagement. Now I've got insight. For instance, if I see that I've not given Josh any task in the last month, but I've given John all the tasks, I need to start assigning those tasks over and make that visible, right? That's the way you start breaking out of leadership fatigue. I got to just share one quick anecdote, Josh, to show you how our thinking on this is kind of whacked. I was with an organization recently and they asked our team to attend their frontline leader training. It was a week long to assess it. On Friday, every frontline leader that graduated got a fireman's hat. I have a fundamental problem with that as the reward for the graduation from the frontline leader course. Because basically, you just taught the frontline leaders to do exactly what I've described on this webinar as what not to do. If you're teaching your leaders to be good firefighters, you're building cultures of dependency, you're building cultures of reaction, and you will drive a culture of leadership fatigue where no one will want to be a leader in your organization. And so, again, it starts with reflection, it starts with introspection, it starts with how are you leading today? And then we would love to provide additional resources on how PQ really becomes a meaningful way to leave a leadership legacy.
Well, Shayna, there's so much to unpack here in this webinar, and I'm thankful for you for offering to provide additional slides as well. There's some of the questions in here, some of the call outs as well. I can just tell you, concepts like regarding the culture of accountability, you calling that out versus the culture of dependency. So important. You've got people in the chat specifically calling that out, people specifically interested in how this gets implemented in the healthcare space, specifically. Maybe last question, maybe speak to some of that just a little bit different, how that can maybe change a little bit, if it even does change a little bit from sector to sector, but also maybe just how PQ can help improve the retention and team management in general at these different types of organizations.
Yeah, Josh, thanks for that. So, just very quickly, I mean, we work across all industries, right? From biotech to traditional manufacturing to finance. I'll be at the World Bank next week to healthcare, right? And I
Mhm.
would tell you, Josh, we have much more in common than we do in difference. And starting the conversation in every one of these engagements that we've done for 30 plus years, it starts with what we have in common. And what we have in common is the mission and the metrics. And so it to us, it makes no difference where you're coming at this from and the industry you're in, because when you look at the fundamentals of PQ, a business acumen process, an execution process, a meaningful communication process, and an ideal behavior system, those are universal across industry. And your second question is, how do you get people to stay? Well, let's talk about why people leave, right? Every HR person would tell you people don't leave organizations, they leave bad leaders. And often the bad leader is one that is a personality driven leader. And so, if we can teach leaders how to manage by systems so that the system feels inclusive, where the system, go back to what I said a second ago, the number one demotivator in teams is the disparity of engagement, where leaders begin to have real conversations with those toxic people on the team and say, no, we've got data now that demonstrates you're not engaged. And so here's a choice for you, right? You either get on board or we're going to promote you to be a customer, right? And you know what? I love kind of that mindset. And good systems give you the ability to do that. When employees see leaders managing by systems which drive clarity, connectivity, and consistency, they'll want to stay every time.
Yeah, great answer. And listen, Shane, I really appreciate your presentation today to Baldrige community and really anyone outside of the Baldrige community that's listening here today and trying to be an ongoing learner just from day to day. How can they soak things up to better improve their current situation individually, but also at their organization? And so we thank you so much for your time today and all that you've been able to provide us.
Thank you,
And then,
Josh. I very much appreciate that. And I just want to close by saying, we believe in all the things we teach. And there's some
yeah.
real exciting news happening for us here at Competitive Solutions. Just
Mhm.
last week, we were, as we began to think about our future and our growth trajectory and how we scale, we are excited to announce that last week we were acquired by Bridgeview Legacy Holdings. I'm stepping into the chairman role and can't wait to dig deeper into with our clients. And our new CEO, Rob Kornblum, is going to be leading Competitive Solutions forward, hopefully to our next 30 years of growth. I have great confidence and enthusiasm about him and the future of our firm, and we can't wait to dig in with our clients and continue the journey that we've been on the last 30 years. So, and Baldrige has been a real part of that for us, Josh. And again, I thank you for our partnership.
Well, thank you so much. And you guys are doing a great job and congratulations on all your success and the information that you provided to us today. We really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks so much, Josh.
So in closing here, the Foundation's Institute for Performance Excellence has more than 400 training and professional development certification opportunities offered online and at your own pace. This month, we are showcasing 4 certification courses relating to today's presentation for Lean Six Sigma Black Belt, Agile Leader, Process Improvement, and of course, Supply Chain Management. You can visit the Institute website at baldridgeinstitute.org/education to learn more and to register. As a reminder, the recorded version of today's presentation and slides will be available on the Foundation's website early next week. And once again, thanks to all of our great sponsors and donors. We hope to see you all again at next month's webinar on June 26th. Thank you again for attending this afternoon's webinar and have a great day, everyone.